The story that you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts, featuring characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. Highgate Cemetery has a reputation for being London's creepiest cemetery. There were rumors that a tall, dark figure with red eyes was seen wandering around the cemetery between the 1960s and the 1970s. The figure appears to have terrorized some people in this location. It was speculated that the figure was a vampire. Highgate Cemetery opened in 1839. It is one of London's most notorious cemeteries. It was originally opened as one of the city's magnificent 7-park cemeteries. Stephen Gary, an architect, was in charge of the initial design. The gravestones of Karl Marx, recognizable by the glowering bearded bust, sci-fi author Douglas Adams, James Holman, a sightless 19th century adventurer known as the Blind Traveler, who was a pioneer of human echolocation. He was able to sense his surroundings by the reverberations of a tapped cane or horse's hoof beats, and Adam Worth, a famous criminal and possible inspiration for Sherlock Holmes' nemesis, Professor Moriarty. The magnificent 7 cemeteries, which include Kensal Green, Highgate West Norwood, Abney Park, Nunhead, Brompton, and Tower Hamlets, were established in 1832 as part of an effort to move burials out of the City of London in response to the twin pressures of health concerns about overcrowded churchyard cemeteries and desires for buildable land in the rapidly expanding city. The cemetery's tombs and buildings are built in an imposing Victorian Gothic style, and it was a popular burial ground from the mid to late 1800s. In addition to the beautiful vast landscape, the cemetery featured ornate tombstones as if the dead were trying to outdo one another. However, after World War II, it fell into a serious disrepair. By the 1960s, the cemetery had deteriorated to the point where it served as the setting for several horror films, including From Beyond the Grave and Taste the Blood of Dracula. It was almost too perfect a setting for wizards to argue about the proper way to kill a vampire. 2 adolescent girls walking home along nearby Swains Lane in 1967 claimed to have seen the dead rising from their graves near the cemetery's north gate. Another adolescent had awoken one night with something cold and clinging on her hand, which left prominent marks the next morning, while reports circulated of a tall man in a hat walking through the cemetery's walls. There was some speculation that a Highgate vampire was lurking in the area. In 1969, one of the members of an occult-interested group spent the night at Highgate Cemetery. He wrote that he saw a gray figure that he thought was supernatural and that he wanted to know if anyone else had seen anything. Others claimed to have seen ghosts roaming the area. The majority of witnesses reported seeing a tall man in a hat, a woman in white, and a face peering through the bars on a gate. In the 1970s, the infamous cemetery became the setting for another English Gothic tradition, Hammer Films horror films. These films reignited public interests in the cemetery, and reports of grave robbing, desecration, and vampires in Highgate began to circulate. Many claimed to see a particular creature hovering over the graves. According to the book Beyond the Grave, hundreds of vampire hunters converged on the graveyard in the dead of the night on a regular basis. Tombs were broken open and bodies were mutilated by driving wooden stakes into their chest. These stolen corpses, which kept turning up in strange places, continued to astound locals. One horrified cemetery visitor discovered a headless body propped behind the steering wheel of his car one morning. In February 1970, the Hampstead and Highgate Express, a local paper, received a letter from David Farrant, the owner of a local tobacconist and self-proclaimed magician, who wrote to say that he'd seen something strange there. On 3 occasions, I have seen what appears to be a ghost-like figure inside the gates of Highgate Cemetery, he wrote, oblivious to the fact that this letter would turn his life upside down. The following week, The same newspaper published letters from several other people who claimed to have witnessed ghostly activities at the cemetery, and Farrant became obsessed with learning more. He was convinced that satanic rituals have been performed in the cemetery and that those who practiced dark magic had conjured up an evil entity and that was now trapped in our realm. The more he looked into it, the more engrossed he became. He was gaining popularity for his stories about strange occurrences in Highgate, such as beheaded foxes, apparitions, and black magic. Then, a man named Sean Manchester, who claimed to be the president of the British Occult Society and claimed an even more startling paranormal insight, backed up by a career as both a self-proclaimed exorcist, vampire hunter, and bishop of the mysterious Old Catholic Church, announced that he had spoken with 2 local witnesses who had been awakened by a strange man in their bedrooms. A man with the expression of an animal, he said. He also claimed that a 3rd woman awoke with 2 red marks on her neck. He declared that this was no ordinary ghoul, but a vampire. And not just any vampire, but a king vampire, such as Dracula. Farrant's revelations spread, but he never believed there was a vampire. Instead, he was convinced it was some other terrifying entity. The Highgate vampire sensation reached a climax in 1970 when Farrant and Manchester both pledged to uncover the truth. On Friday, March 13, 1970, ITV announced that it would be at the cemetery at the appointed hour to interview both Farrant and Manchester, who had both pledged to get to the truth despite growing animosity between them. As crowds of vampire hunters began to form, 40 police officers were called in to maintain order. They were unsuccessful because desperate crowds climbed over the railings armed with crucifixes, stakes, knives, and beer bottles. Screams could be heard in the darkness as vampire hunters tripped over each other. The cemetery had been desecrated. Several graves had been uncovered, and one had an iron stake driven into the coffin. Although no ghoul was discovered, police began patrolling the cemetery to ensure that Farrant and Manchester were not lurking around. Strange things continued to occur, however. Graves were being dislodged and there was evidence of Satanism. In the months that followed, a number of corpses were discovered in the cemetery in various states of disarray. One without a head, another burned to a crisp. While no vampire was ever discovered in the cemetery, Farrant was apprehended by police in the churchyard next to Highgate Cemetery one night in August, carrying a crucifix and a wooden stake. When the case was heard in court, it was thrown out. Manchester returned to Highgate Cemetery a few days later. He claims that he and his companions forced open the doors of a family vault this time, indicated by his psychic helper. He claims he lifted the lid of one coffin, believing it had been mysteriously transferred there from another catacomb. He was about to drive a stake through the body when he was stopped by a companion. He closed the coffin reluctantly, leaving garlic and incense in the vault. Farrant and Manchester received more attention when rumors circulated that they would meet in a magician's duel on Parliament Hill on Friday, April 13, 1973, and that the 2 were planning to sacrifice a cat in front of naked virgins. The duels never took place. Farrant was imprisoned in 1974 for vandalizing memorials and interfering with the remains of the dead at Highgate Cemetery. Vandalism and desecration he claimed was caused by Satanists, not him. He was imprisoned for 3 years. Meanwhile, Manchester claimed to have tracked the vampire down to a nearby house where he stabbed it with a stake and set it on fire. Farrant and Manchester discussed the Highgate vampire frequently, each emphasizing his own role to the exclusion of the other. Each attempted to control the narrative surrounding the Highgate vampire, which resulted in antagonism and rivalry between the 2. Their feud raged on for decades, punctuated by insults and vengeance until Farrant's death in April of 2019. The cemetery is still a popular haunt for occult, paranormal, and vampiric enthusiasts. Hey everyone, I just wanted to say that I am incredibly grateful that you took time out of your schedule to listen to my narration. This is Nikki of Twysted Mind, Wishing you a great rest of your day. Salamat.